Ever wonder what happens when a ruthless millionaire bets his fortune on transforming a broken life into a high society fairy tale? What if the bet wasn't just about money, but about the heart, and what it takes to truly change? Nathan Parker stood alone on the expansive balcony of his penthouse, the cool night air brushing against his skin as he gazed out at the sprawling city below. The view was nothing short of breathtaking. Skyscrapers stretched into the heavens, their windows reflecting the soft glow of countless streetlights. The lights flickered in perfect synchrony, like stars in a constellation, illuminating the city in hues of gold and silver. To Nathan, this was the perfect representation of his life. Success, power, control. Nathan had it all: money, influence, a world at his feet. And yet, standing there on that balcony, he felt an emptiness gnawing at the edges of his soul. He was a man who could purchase anything he desired with a simple swipe of his credit card. If he wanted a new car, it was there the next day. If he desired a trip to a distant continent, his private jet was ready to take him. But despite his boundless wealth, there was one thing money couldn't buy. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on, yet felt its absence deeply. Perhaps it was love. Perhaps it was meaning. Whatever it was, it eluded him, like an itch he couldn't reach. Tonight, however, would present him with something more than just his usual indulgences. Tonight would be different. His longtime friend, Michael Carter, leaned against the railing beside him, an enigmatic grin playing on his lips. Michael was a man who lived for games. Mind games, wagers, anything that could get a reaction out of Nathan. "Nathan," Michael said, his voice smooth, like the wine he swirled slowly in his glass. The glass caught the light as he raised it toward Nathan in mock toast. "You always say money can buy anything. Well, prove it." Nathan took another sip of his champagne, his face impassive as he studied Michael through half-closed eyes. He wasn't one to entertain childish dares. He had been through countless challenges, each more predictable than the last. But something about the glint in Michael's eyes made him pause. "I already have," Nathan replied coldly, his tone laced with indifference. "What's your point?" Michael's grin widened, and with a subtle tilt of his head, he motioned toward the street below. The lights from the city reflected on the pavement, and Nathan's gaze followed Michael's finger. Below, on the sidewalk, sat a woman, a young woman, her clothes worn and ragged, her hair unkempt. She was barefoot, huddled close to a small piece of cardboard that she clutched with one hand. Her eyes were tired, hollow, reflecting the weight of countless days spent struggling to survive in a world that had long since abandoned her. Michael's voice dropped to a challenge, a provocative gleam in his eyes. "Her," he said, his finger pointing at the woman sitting on the sidewalk. "Bet you can't take that ugly beggar and turn her into a high society wife in 3 months. If you succeed, you get $2 million. But if you fail..." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, his smile wide with expectation. "You lose everything." Nathan's gaze locked onto the woman below. At first glance, she seemed like nothing more than another soul crushed by life, another forgotten person. A part of him saw only a game, a challenge to conquer. But as he studied her, something flickered in his chest. Her gaze, though weary, held a quiet strength. There was something in the way she sat, her back straight despite the cold pavement, her eyes sharp despite their exhaustion. She was not just a beggar, she was a survivor. For the first time in a long while, Nathan felt the stirrings of intrigue. A challenge, a test. His lips curved into a cynical smile, the idea of a bet too tantalizing to resist. He had always prided himself on his ability to control any situation, to manipulate and bend people to his will. This woman, she would be no different. She would be nothing more than another pawn in his game. He didn't need to think about it. He had never failed in his life, and he wasn't about to start now. "You're on," Nathan said, his voice as cold and calculating as ever. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. It was a done deal. "You'll regret making that bet, Michael. She'll be unrecognizable in 3 months. I'll have her in the highest circles of society, and I'll make it look effortless." Michael's smile widened, satisfied with the response. He took another sip of his wine, savoring the moment. "You'll see," Michael said, his tone low and knowing. "I've never seen you so sure of something before. This is going to be interesting." Nathan turned, heading toward the door, his thoughts already racing ahead. This would be a game he was sure to win. After all, money could buy anything, didn't it? But as he stepped out into the night, leaving the comfort of the penthouse for the cold streets below, a small voice, one he hadn't expected, whispered in the back of his mind. What if this time, it's not just about winning? The thought was fleeting, but it stayed with him, lingering in the shadows. Still, Nathan dismissed it as quickly as it came. After all, it was just another bet. Emily Clark had been living on the streets for as long as she could remember. It was a life she never chose, but one she was forced to accept. Every morning, she woke to the cold sting of winter air, the sound of distant sirens, and the harsh sunlight filtering through grimy windows of the alleyways she called home. The days blurred into one another, marked only by the search for food and the desperate longing for a fleeting moment of warmth. The nights were the hardest. The loneliness, the exhaustion, the constant gnawing hunger. It was all part of her existence now. Her clothes were tattered, mismatched, barely enough to protect her from the elements. Her hair, once full of life and shine, hung limp and dull, a tangled mess that no longer held the strength it once had. Her skin was pale, dry, a permanent reminder of the years spent under the unforgiving sun and the cruel winds. Her eyes, once bright with the potential of youth, had long since dulled. They no longer carried the hope they once had, instead replaced with a weary understanding of the world that had turned its back on her. To most people, she was invisible, just another casualty of a society that discarded those who couldn't keep up. But if there was one thing Emily had learned during her years of survival on the streets, it was resilience. Her heart, though battered by loss and hardship, never stopped beating. She had been through more than most people could imagine, and yet she was still standing, still fighting. There was strength in her, an inner fire that refused to be extinguished no matter how many times life tried to snuff it out. She had seen the worst of the world, yet she still managed to rise every day, even if it was just to survive for one more. Her strength didn't go unnoticed. As Emily huddled against the side of a building, clutching her cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps," her eyes darted cautiously toward the polished shoes that appeared in front of her. She had become used to the cold indifference of passers-by, the occasional sympathetic glance quickly followed by averted eyes. She had learned to ignore them, just as they had learned to ignore her. But this was different. A man stood before her, tall, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed wealth and power, his polished shoes reflecting the dim streetlight. His face was stoic, sharp, and his eyes, cold, calculating, seemed to pierce right through her. Emily blinked slowly, barely registering his presence, as if she could will him away like so many others. Her body was stiff from the cold, and her mind, foggy from lack of sleep and food, was struggling to process his sudden appearance. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice smooth, demanding, with an edge of authority that made her stomach churn. There was no warmth in his tone, no sympathy. He wasn't speaking to her as a person. He was speaking to her as a problem to be solved. Emily lifted her eyes just enough to meet his gaze, her voice hoarse from disuse. "What do you want?" she asked, her words laced with weariness. She had heard it all before, empty offers, condescending pity, and hollow promises. She wasn't interested in any of it. Nathan Parker didn't flinch at her tone. He had seen it all, people who were desperate, people who had been beaten down by life, people who had lost everything. They were all the same to him. And Emily, she was no different. She was just another project, another challenge for him to conquer. "I have a proposition for you," Nathan said, leaning slightly forward. His voice was sharp, almost dismissive, but there was an undeniable edge to it, a promise of something bigger. 3 months, $1 million. You'll never have to struggle again. You'll live like you've always dreamed. Emily's mind raced as she processed his words. $1 million? It was hard to imagine. It was a sum so far beyond her reality, beyond anything she had ever seen in her life. Her heart skipped a beat, but a flicker of doubt quickly followed. People didn't just offer $1 million deals to people like her. She was just another beggar in the city, a ghost to passers-by. Why would he care enough to offer her such an absurd amount of money? Her eyes narrowed in suspicion as she studied him. There was no warmth, no kindness in his expression, only a cold, calculating look that made her uncomfortable. She felt exposed under his gaze, like a specimen being evaluated, and it made her defensive. "Why me?" she asked, her voice thick with uncertainty and a hint of disbelief. "Why not anyone else?" Nathan stood tall, unwavering, his gaze never leaving hers. "Because you're here," he answered flatly. His tone was cold, without explanation, as if his reasoning was too simple for her to question. "And you're the perfect challenge." The words hung in the air like a challenge in itself. Emily's heart thudded in her chest. $1 million, a life-changing sum. The opportunity to escape the streets, to never have to face another cold night again, to not have to worry about where her next meal was coming from. It was the kind of offer she had dreamed of in fleeting moments of exhaustion, the kind of offer that seemed too good to be true. And yet, something about Nathan's words rang hollow. He wasn't offering her this out of kindness. He wasn't offering it to help her. No, he saw her as a project, a pawn in some twisted game. He didn't care about her story, her struggles, her pain. He only cared about winning. The silence between them stretched, and Emily could feel her resolve beginning to waver. She could walk away. She knew that. But the hunger gnawing at her stomach, the cold creeping into her bones, and the exhaustion in her heart made it hard to think clearly. She had nothing to lose, and yet everything to gain. But the doubt still lingered. Was this too good to be true? Was she walking into something that would destroy her in ways she couldn't even imagine? Nathan watched her closely, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp, watching her every movement. He didn't need her to hesitate. He didn't need her to question. He just needed her to accept. Emily looked away for a moment, her gaze fixed on the sign in her hands, as if seeking comfort in something familiar. Her breath was shallow, her thoughts racing. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her, could feel the storm of emotions swirling inside her chest. She had lived her entire life on the edge, fighting, surviving, but never truly living. Could this be the chance to change that, or was it just another trap? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Emily raised her eyes back to Nathan, her voice steady, despite the turmoil within. "I'll do it," she said quietly. There was no excitement in her words, no relief, only a quiet acceptance, a surrender to the unknown. Nathan's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. He knew she would say yes. In fact, he had been certain of it from the beginning. For her, this was an opportunity too tempting to pass up. But for him, this was just the beginning, a game he intended to win. The deal was made. Emily had agreed to his proposition, and now her life, her very identity, was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. And Nathan, he would never have expected just how much this challenge would change him. With her simple words, "I'll do it," Nathan had won. There was no turning back now. Emily had made her choice, though she hardly felt victorious. The moment the words left her lips, the reality of what she had agreed to began to settle in, heavy and oppressive. This wasn't just a transaction. This wasn't some fleeting moment of opportunity. This was her life, her entire existence, placed on the line. Everything she had known, everything she had been, was about to be rewritten. As she followed Nathan to the sleek black car waiting on the side of the street, Emily's mind churned with doubt. The cold pavement beneath her feet, the ragged clothes on her back, and the weight of the cardboard sign she had been clutching all seemed to belong to a distant past. She felt disconnected from everything that had once been her life. Her old self, the girl who had learned to survive through grit and desperation, now felt like a stranger. But she couldn't help but wonder as they drove away from the city streets, leaving behind the world that had shaped her. What was she giving up by accepting this? She was so used to the harshness of her reality, to the constant battle of finding food, staying warm, and fighting against a system that saw her as nothing more than a nuisance. In the streets, she had learned that no one cared. No one noticed the people like her, the people who were left behind. This new life Nathan was offering her, this world of luxury, of wealth, of endless possibilities, was so far removed from the life she knew that it seemed like a dream. But at what cost? Was she willing to lose herself in the process? Was she ready to sell her soul for the chance to escape? Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, trembled slightly as the car sped through the city, taking her farther away from everything she had known. She glanced out of the window at the passing buildings, the flashing lights of a world she had never belonged to. She wasn't sure where she was headed. The streets, the alleys, the small corners of the city where she had spent her life, they were all slipping away from her. Would she ever find her way back? Was this worth it? Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Types no if you've made it this far. Only those who get this far will understand. Now let's get back to the story. Nathan didn't seem to notice her internal turmoil. His focus was fixed solely on the road ahead, his face a mask of calm indifference. To him, this was just another game, a simple challenge, a bet to win. He didn't care about her struggle. He didn't care about the years she had spent fighting for survival, for dignity, for even the smallest scrap of kindness. To him, Emily was nothing more than a tool, a pawn in a game of status and wealth. But Emily wasn't just a pawn. She wasn't some object to be molded and discarded. She was a woman who had fought tooth and nail to survive in a world that had shown her no mercy. She had been kicked down time and time again, but she always rose. She always found a way to keep going. She had learned the art of survival, of navigating the darkness with nothing but her will to live. That strength had carried her through everything, from cold nights in alleys to days spent begging for scraps. She had learned that she could survive on nothing, but could she thrive in a world that had no place for people like her? As they continued driving, the weight of her decision grew heavier. Was this just her last shot at freedom, or was it a trap she had willingly walked into? Was Nathan offering her a life of ease, or was he simply offering her a gilded cage? They drove for what seemed like hours before finally reaching their destination. Emily felt a rush of anxiety and disbelief as the car turned down a long, winding driveway. She had never seen a house like this before. The mansion loomed ahead, massive and imposing, its white columns reaching toward the sky like silent sentinels. The gates swung open automatically as they approached, revealing the sprawling grounds beyond. Perfectly manicured gardens, long pathways lined with statues, and a driveway that seemed to stretch for miles. The entire estate was bathed in a soft, golden glow, the lights from the mansion spilling onto the grounds like a beacon of opulence. When the car finally came to a stop, Emily stepped out, her legs unsteady, as the reality of her situation hit her like a freight train. She stood there, frozen, her mouth dry as she took in the grandeur of her surroundings. This was not the world she knew. This was not the world she belonged to. The walls of the mansion loomed over her like a fortress, a stark contrast to the streets she had spent her life on. The staff stood waiting for them at the entrance, their expressions blank, their movements precise. There were no smiles, no warmth in their eyes, just an unspoken understanding of who Nathan was and what he could offer. Emily felt their gaze on her, but she couldn't meet their eyes. She was out of place here. She wasn't supposed to be here. Everything felt foreign, like she had stepped into a world that didn't know how to accommodate someone like her. The floors were made of marble, cold and hard under her feet. The chandeliers overhead sparkled with an intensity that made her feel small and insignificant. The air itself felt heavy with wealth, with entitlement. Every corner of the mansion seemed to scream that this was a world reserved for a select few, people like Nathan, who had everything handed to them on a silver platter. As she walked through the entrance, she felt like a stranger in someone else's life. It wasn't just the opulence that overwhelmed her. It was the feeling of being swallowed whole by a life that wasn't her own. She had fought for every inch of survival on the streets, but here, she felt as though she was losing herself with every step she took. This was the price of her survival. This was what she had agreed to, but at what cost? And as Nathan led her through the grand halls of the mansion, his voice calm and assured as he explained the details of the arrangement, Emily couldn't help but wonder if she had made a mistake. She had traded her past, her pain, her identity, for a future that felt just as uncertain as the streets she had left behind. The moment they arrived at the mansion, Nathan wasted no time. This was his domain, his world, one that he had built with precise care and absolute control. Emily, in her ragged clothes and weary demeanor, was nothing more than a temporary project in his eyes. To him, she was just another challenge to prove his ability to shape anything, or anyone, into his vision of perfection. It wasn't personal. It was business, a bet, a conquest, a victory waiting to be claimed. Nathan's first order of business was to give her a makeover, an overhaul that would completely change her from the woman she was into something that fit into his carefully constructed world. He didn't see her as a person with a story or a past. He saw only potential to be polished, perfected, and made into the ideal image that he could present as his success. The first step was the clothes. He'd already arranged for an entire wardrobe to be delivered, expensive designer pieces that spoke of elegance and sophistication. Dresses that shimmered with understated beauty, tailored suits that would transform her once worn and torn attire into the image of someone who belonged in society's elite circles. As the seamstresses and stylists worked their magic, Emily was overwhelmed by the sensory bombardment, silk fabrics, fine cottons, materials she had never dared touch. As the fitting continued, she felt out of place in the delicate clothes, like an imposter in a world that had no room for her. She had never worn anything like this before. The soft fabrics clung to her skin, and the expensive perfume that wafted from her clothes was foreign, almost suffocating. But as the transformation took place, Emily couldn't deny that something inside her stirred. She caught glimpses of herself in the mirror, her face now framed by elegant hair, and her posture straightened by the careful work of the stylist's hands. It wasn't just the clothes, though. It was the way she looked at herself. For the first time in years, she didn't see a desperate, hungry woman staring back. She saw someone who could be more. She saw someone who had the potential to rise above the dirt and filth of her past. The stylist stepped back, admiring her work, and for a brief moment, Emily caught a glimpse of herself. The woman she could be in a different life, in a different world. But the reflection quickly faded as she was led to the dining room. Nathan had already arranged for the finest meal the city could offer, a feast fit for royalty. The table was set with the finest china, silver, and crystal, gleaming under the soft light of the chandeliers above. Waiters, moving like clockwork, served her delicate courses of gourmet food, each dish more elaborate than the last. Everything was flawless. Everything was perfect, but it felt hollow. Emily sat at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she picked at her food. It wasn't the food itself that bothered her. It was the feeling that she didn't belong here. She didn't know how to eat this way, how to sit at a table this grand, how to pretend she was something she wasn't. Each bite felt like a reminder of how far she had strayed from the world she once knew. She had fought for every meal on the street. Every scrap of food had been earned with sweat and desperation. This, though, this felt like a mockery. She hadn't earned this meal. She hadn't earned any of it. As she lifted her glass of fine wine, her reflection in the crystal shimmered, and for the first time since she'd agreed to Nathan's proposition, she thought about her past. The streets, the nights spent huddled in alleyways, the loneliness, the despair. And now, she was here, dining in luxury. But it wasn't real. She knew it wasn't real. Nathan watched her carefully across the table, his eyes studying her every move. To him, this was just part of the plan, part of the process of transforming her from someone who was invisible, unworthy, into someone who could stand beside him in his high society world. But there was a strange discomfort he couldn't shake. He had done this before. He had transformed people, bought their loyalty, shaped their lives with money. He had always seen it as a way to prove his power, his superiority over those who were weaker. But as Emily sat there, surrounded by luxury, Nathan couldn't help but notice something in her, something that was slipping through the cracks of his cold, calculated exterior. She wasn't just a blank canvas for him to paint with his money and his influence. She wasn't just a tool to win the bet. There was a depth to her, something raw and human, something he hadn't expected to find in a woman like her, someone who had lived through the worst life could throw at her, and yet had not given up. She didn't just accept the transformation, she resisted it, quietly, in ways that Nathan could see, but couldn't fully understand. As he watched her try to adapt to this new world, something shifted inside him. He couldn't put it into words, but he felt it, a tug, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. It was as though the cold armor he had built around himself, piece by piece, was beginning to crack. She was not just a pawn in his game. She was something more. Nathan had always prided himself on his ability to manipulate, to control, to turn any situation into his favor. But Emily, she wasn't like the others. She wasn't just a blank slate for him to mold into something better. She wasn't the fragile, weak woman he thought she'd be. There was strength in her, strength he hadn't noticed at first. It was a quiet strength, the kind that came from having survived the worst and still standing tall. As Emily adjusted to the luxurious surroundings, her posture improving, her demeanor more composed, Nathan saw a different side of her. She wasn't just a challenge. She wasn't just a bet. She was a woman of substance, a woman who had layers, who had history. And though Nathan had always believed he could control everything, every situation, every person, he couldn't control this. He couldn't control her. And for the first time in a long time, Nathan felt a sense of uncertainty. It was a foreign sensation, one that made him uneasy. This wasn't just about the bet anymore. This wasn't about winning or losing. This was something else entirely. Emily wasn't just a project. She wasn't just someone to be shaped. She was becoming something else, something he wasn't prepared for. And in that moment, Nathan realized something he hadn't expected. She was changing him too. The mansion was enormous. Its endless corridors and high ceilings felt like they were built for someone other than her, for someone who belonged here, in this world of luxury and perfection. Emily found herself wandering the halls one night, her thoughts restless, her mind unable to settle. The mansion, despite its beauty, felt like a prison. She was constantly reminded of how out of place she was. Every room, every marble floor, every grand staircase whispered that she didn't belong. As she walked through the quiet, echoing halls, Emily stumbled into a study. It was a large, dimly lit room filled with bookshelves, leather-bound volumes, and antique furniture. A grand desk stood in the middle of the room, papers neatly stacked on one side, a laptop opened, and glowing faintly. There was a framed picture on the desk of a younger Nathan, smiling in a setting that looked far less austere than the mansion's surroundings. But what caught Emily's attention wasn't the photo. It was a small box tucked into the corner of the desk. Curious, she approached it, her fingers lingering over the smooth surface before lifting the lid. Inside was a collection of old documents, neatly filed and stacked. Among them, one paper stood out. It was a job application form from many years ago. As Emily scanned the date, her heart skipped a beat. It was from a time long before this mansion, long before Nathan's transformation into the wealthy and powerful man he was today. And yet, the moment she saw her own name on the form, everything in her mind came rushing back. Years ago, Emily had been different. She had been full of hope, eager to start anew, to make something of herself. She had worn her best outfit, a second-hand blazer, and a pair of shoes that pinched her feet, but she didn't care. She had pressed her resume between two trembling hands, convinced that if she just had the chance, she could prove herself. Her goal had been simple: to work for Parker Enterprises, to earn enough to escape her desperate circumstances. That was before she had known what the real world looked like, before she had experienced rejection time and time again, before she had learned that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. Her heart ached as she remembered that day, the stark fluorescent lights of the office, the sterile walls that made the space feel like a holding cell. She had sat in the waiting room, anxiously clutching her resume, her hands slick with nervous sweat. When her name had been called, she had stood up quickly, trying to compose herself. She remembered the cold glass doors of the office opening. And there he was, Nathan Parker, sitting behind his polished desk, eyes fixed on his laptop, his presence imposing, his demeanor detached. She had expected some warmth, some kindness. After all, this was her chance, her big break. But as she had sat across from him, her breath catching in her throat, she saw nothing but indifference. Nathan hadn't looked up when she entered. He hadn't bothered to make small talk or even acknowledge her presence in a friendly way. His eyes remained glued to his screen as if she were just another name on a list of thousands, another person to dismiss. When she had nervously handed him her resume, he barely glanced at it, let alone read it. His fingers barely moved as they flipped through the papers, his gaze distant, as if he had better things to do. The silence between them had stretched, unbearable and suffocating. And then finally, Nathan had spoken. His voice had been low, measured, and chillingly disinterested. "We're all disposable," he had said, his words cutting through the air like a knife. "Your resume means nothing. We all have our place, and this is not yours." Emily could still feel the sting of that moment. The words, the coldness in his eyes, the finality of his dismissal. It had shattered something inside her. She had walked out of that office with her head held high, but inside she had died a little. He had taken something from her that day. Not just the job she had desperately wanted, but the belief that she could ever belong in a world like his. She had been naive back then, and Nathan had made sure to remind her of that with every dismissive word. He had treated her like she was just another face in the crowd, just another applicant to be thrown away. At that moment, she had learned the hard truth about people like him. They didn't see her. They didn't care about her struggles, her dreams, or her potential. She was nothing more than an inconvenience, a part of the scenery that could be easily discarded. Now, sitting across from him again, this time in the opulence of his mansion, Emily felt the rush of old emotions, the anger, the humiliation, the defeat. But something else had changed. She wasn't that girl anymore. She wasn't the naive woman who had walked into Parker Enterprises looking for a chance. She had grown stronger, wiser, The years spent fighting to survive had changed her. She had learned to trust herself, to fight for herself, and to never rely on the kindness of others for validation. As she sat there, staring at Nathan across the dining table, she saw him with different eyes. He was still the same man, the cold, indifferent figure who had once dismissed her. But now, Emily knew better. He had underestimated her, and he didn't even know it. He had thought she was just another vulnerable soul to manipulate, to mold into whatever shape he saw fit. But she wasn't a blank slate. She wasn't a pawn in his game. The realization hit her like a jolt of electricity. Nathan had never understood her. He had never understood what it took to survive in the world she came from. And now, he was going to see just how far she had come. She wasn't disposable. She never had been. And Nathan Parker was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Nathan had always viewed people as projects, challenges to be conquered, puzzles to be solved. And Emily, she was no different. To him, she was just another object in need of transformation, something to be molded, shaped, and perfected according to his exacting standards. His view of her was pragmatic, cold. She was just a pawn in the game, a means to an end. Nathan had a knack for turning things, people especially, into versions of themselves that suited his purpose, and Emily was no exception. From the very beginning, Nathan set the rules. He defined the terms, dictated the pace, and gave her little room to question him. His world was one of control, and everyone in it played their part. But Emily, to his surprise, didn't fit neatly into that world. She didn't bend to his expectations the way others did. She didn't flinch when he used his wealth and status to manipulate situations. Instead, she stood firm, unbroken by his icy demeanor, her strength becoming more and more apparent with each passing day. It was that difference, the defiance, the quiet resilience, that intrigued Nathan more than he cared to admit. At first, he tried to ignore it, dismissing it as a mere obstacle in his mission. But as the days went on, he found himself drawn to it, unable to simply control her like he could with others. Emily wasn't just another project. She was a force, one that refused to be bent to his will without a fight. And as he watched her hold her ground, Nathan's perception of her began to shift. Slowly, imperceptibly, the power dynamics between them began to change. Emily was no longer just a pawn. She wasn't an object to be manipulated. No, she was becoming something more, something Nathan wasn't prepared for. In the weeks that followed, Emily continued to adapt to the life Nathan had set before her. The manners, the grace, the etiquette, things she had never cared about, things she had never needed, slowly became part of her new reality. At first, Nathan thought this transformation was his doing, that she was simply responding to the structure he had created for her. But as he watched her, he began to realize that it wasn't just about the clothes, the charm, or the proper posture. Emily was beginning to thrive in this world. She was thriving in ways he hadn't expected. She had always been resilient, but now she was learning to navigate the complexities of this luxury-filled life. She began to move with a quiet confidence, her manners impeccable, her demeanor calm, despite the tension brewing beneath the surface. She had always had the strength to survive the streets, but now she was learning to survive the world Nathan had created for her, a world she had never imagined for herself. Nathan couldn't help but watch her as she moved through this new life. There was a subtle shift in him as well. He had always been cold, detached, driven by the need to win, to control. But as he saw Emily grow, something inside him began to crack. It wasn't just admiration he felt for her resilience. It was something deeper, something he wasn't ready to confront. She wasn't just a project anymore. She wasn't the bet he had placed on a whim. She was real. And as her strength seeped into every corner of her new life, Nathan felt his own walls start to come down, bit by bit. He found himself looking at her differently. She wasn't just an obstacle, an opportunity for him to prove his power. Let's have some fun with the readers in the comments. Type hot dog if you've made it this far. Now let's get back to the story. She was a woman who had been through more than most, a woman who had learned to stand tall in a world that had tried to break her. And in that quiet, subtle way, Emily was changing him too. He had never expected that. The tension between them had been building for days, an unspoken charge that finally exploded one evening during a car ride. They had spent the day at some high society event, another occasion Nathan had orchestrated, another piece of his grand plan. Emily had played her part perfectly, slipping into her role with grace and poise. But the moment they were alone, the cracks began to show. Emily's voice was sharp as she broke the silence. "You think I'm just a bet to you, don't you?" she demanded, her words biting through the calm. "You think I'm just some project, some challenge you can conquer?" Nathan's breath caught in his throat. He had heard the frustration in her voice before, but this was different. This wasn't just anger, it was something deeper. Hurt, betrayal. He had pushed her too far, and now she was letting him know it. His mind raced, but his mouth stayed shut. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't have the words to defend himself. He had always been the one with control, the one who had answers, who knew what to say, how to manipulate the situation to his advantage. But now, as Emily's raw pain hung in the air between them, Nathan's heart felt like lead in his chest. He couldn't respond. He couldn't fix this. Emily's anger was palpable, but beneath it, there was something deeper. A realization that she had trusted him in ways she hadn't even realized. She had let him into her life, had allowed him to change her, to remake her. But now, it felt like she had been nothing more than a pawn in his game. And Nathan, he was just another man who saw her as something to control. The words stung, and Nathan felt them settle deep into his bones. He couldn't deny what she was saying. He had treated her like an object, like a thing to be used. And now, for the first time, he understood the weight of his actions. The next day, Emily disappeared. Nathan wasn't thinking about the bet. He wasn't thinking about the money or the terms of their arrangement. He wasn't even thinking about his pride. What consumed him, what overwhelmed him, was the thought of losing her. He had spent the better part of his life controlling everything, manipulating situations, never letting anything or anyone slip through his grasp. But now, Emily had slipped away from him. She was gone, and Nathan couldn't fix it. He called everyone he could think of, staff, friends, even old contacts, searching for her, trying to find where she had gone. His heart raced in a way he had never felt before. It wasn't just panic. It was something else. He needed to know she was okay. He needed to see her. It wasn't about the bet. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about her. Nathan found Emily in the hospital the following day. She was weak, feverish, and fragile. A stark contrast to the strong, resilient woman who had stood before him. She looked so vulnerable, so far removed from the composed figure he had come to admire. As he sat by her side, watching her sleep, something inside him broke. For the first time, Nathan felt something real. His concern wasn't just about her appearance or how she fit into his world. It was about her well-being, her health, her life. He cared about her. He stayed with her all night, keeping vigil by her side, watching over her like she was something precious, something worth protecting. This wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't a bet. This was real. And for the first time in his life, Nathan wasn't sure what to do with that feeling. The next morning, when Emily awoke, Nathan was still there, sitting quietly beside her bed. His face was etched with worry, his eyes tired but watchful. There was no pretense in his posture now, no cold facade. He was just a man, concerned for the woman lying before him. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything he had ever said before. "I shouldn't have pushed you so hard. I didn't see you. Not really." Emily's eyes were clouded with doubt, but she could feel the sincerity in his words. "You've spent your life seeing people as things to control, Nathan. I'm just another project to you." "No," he replied, shaking his head slowly. "You're not. You never were." There was a long silence. Emily's heart beat heavily in her chest, and she could feel the warmth of his words trying to break down the walls she had built around herself. For so long, she had kept everyone at a distance. But something about Nathan's presence, his vulnerability, made it hard to resist. He didn't try to convince her further. He simply stayed, his actions speaking louder than any words could. As the days passed, his concern for her grew deeper, and Emily began to see a side of Nathan that was unfamiliar. He wasn't just the man who had turned her life into a project. He was changing, whether he realized it or not. And so was she. Once Emily had recovered enough to leave the hospital, Nathan invited her back to the mansion. The days following her release had been tense, full of unspoken words and lingering doubts. The wounds she carried were still fresh, and though she was physically healed, the emotional scars remained. But Nathan, sensing the need for a change, didn't ask her to return to the sterile, cold environment of her temporary quarters. Instead, he took her to a place that held an unexpected promise. Nathan had arranged for her return to be different, to give her something that wasn't tied to her role as his bet or project. Something for her, and only her. When Emily stepped inside the mansion, Nathan led her through the familiar grand halls, their footsteps echoing softly. But this time, he didn't take her to her usual quarters. Instead, they stopped at a door she hadn't noticed before, tucked away at the far end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and a soft, inviting light spilled out from the crack. Nathan hesitated before pushing the door open. "I know you like painting," he said, his voice tentative, almost uncertain. It was a rare moment for him, an openness he hadn't shown before. "I thought you might like a space of your own." Emily stood frozen at the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this. The room was far different from everything she had seen in the mansion so far. It wasn't a reflection of wealth, of luxury. It was a space that spoke of something much more personal, something Nathan hadn't needed to give, but chose to. The walls were lined with large canvases, stretching from floor to ceiling. Brushes of all shapes and sizes were neatly arranged along the counters, and pots of colourful paints stood ready to be used. In the corner, a large wooden easel awaited her touch. The room was bathed in soft, warm light, creating a tranquil atmosphere that felt like a sanctuary. Emily's heart raced, but this time it wasn't from fear or anxiety. It was from something different, something deep, something that stirred her chest with a new emotion she couldn't quite name. This room wasn't just a gift of luxury, it was a gift of understanding. Nathan hadn't just placed her in a world of excess. He had given her a place to be herself, a space to breathe, to exist beyond the rules and expectations that had confined her. Nathan had for the first time seen her, not as a project, not as a pawn, but as a person with her own desires, her own needs. She stepped inside the room slowly, her fingers brushing over the brushes and the smooth canvas. The scent of fresh paint filled the air, mixing with the faint traces of linseed oil and wood. It was all so familiar, so comforting. She hadn't touched a brush in what felt like forever. Her art had been the only thing that truly belonged to her, the only thing that had ever felt like an escape from the harsh realities of life. It was her refuge, and now it was here, in a room that was hers. "I didn't know what to expect," Emily said softly, her voice filled with emotion. She swallowed, trying to keep her composure, but the tears that threatened to fall were ones she couldn't hold back. "But this is more than I ever thought possible." Nathan nodded, his expression serious, but there was something different in his eyes, something that wasn't there before. There was a sincerity, a depth of understanding that she had never seen from him. He wasn't just offering her luxury or convenience anymore. He was offering her space to grow, to heal, to become herself again. He had given her something no amount of money could buy. He had given her the freedom to rediscover the person she used to be, the person she had almost forgotten. "You don't need to thank me," Nathan said quietly. "I just wanted you to have a place where you could be you." For a moment, there was silence between them, an understanding that passed through the air like a quiet whisper. Emily's hands shook slightly as she reached for the brushes. She wasn't sure if it was the weight of the moment or the emotions that had flooded through her in such a short time, but she was overcome by the intensity of it all. As she dipped the brush into the paint, something shifted inside her. She wasn't just creating on the canvas, she was creating a new reality for herself, one where she didn't have to be anyone's project or challenge. She was just Emily again, and that, for the first time in a long time, felt like enough. Nathan watched her from the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. But inside, something stirred in him as well. For the first time, he wasn't just shaping Emily to fit his idea of perfection. He wasn't trying to force her into a mold. He was allowing her to shape herself in a world he had built for her. And in doing so, he had unknowingly let a piece of himself begin to change too. As Emily continued to paint, her movements becoming more fluid and natural, Nathan realized that this wasn't about control anymore. This wasn't about power or manipulation. This was about something deeper, something more real. For the first time, he had allowed someone to be themselves without trying to change them. And in that, Nathan found himself learning something he had never expected: how to care. As the days turned into weeks, Emily and Nathan began working together on various social projects, each one aimed at helping the underprivileged and giving those who had been forgotten a chance to build a better life. It wasn't just about throwing money at a cause, it was about true involvement. Nathan had always been detached, his charity limited to writing checks, his involvement little more than a checkbox on his list of obligations. But now, there was a marked difference in him. He was no longer the man who stood apart from the world of the less fortunate, no longer the man who saw the poor as another group of people to be ignored, dismissed, or bypassed. As they visited local shelters, food banks, and schools, Nathan's demeanor began to change. He was no longer just giving away money for the sake of it. He was talking to people, listening to their stories, and in some small way, becoming a part of their lives. Emily watched him closely as they spent hours talking to the children, the families, and the volunteers. She saw the quiet transformation happening in him. His heart, which had once been hardened by years of privilege and a cold upbringing, was slowly opening. This wasn't about him assuaging guilt anymore. It wasn't about charity as a social obligation. He was doing this because he had begun to care. Nathan didn't say it outright. He didn't have to. Emily could see it in the way he spent extra time with the children, in the way he listened attentively to the elderly woman who had once been homeless and now ran a shelter. Nathan was giving more than money. He was giving his time, his attention. And for the first time, Emily understood that Nathan was starting to understand the depth of human connection. He wasn't just helping, he was genuinely invested. Still, Emily watched from a distance. Her past fears hadn't evaporated completely. There were moments when she would catch herself wondering if Nathan had truly changed, or if this was just another phase. Was he trying to make up for the bet? Was this his way of proving he wasn't as cold as he once was? She had no clear answers. The past had left its marks on her. She had been hurt before, too many times to count, and she couldn't let herself be swept away by his actions just yet. But despite her doubts, she felt something stirring within her, a cautious hope. Maybe Nathan had changed. Maybe he could learn to care. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to rebuild what had been broken. One evening, after another long day working with a local community, Nathan took Emily aside. It had been a day filled with packing food for families, organizing clothing donations, and helping build a new play area for children at a school in need. They had spent hours with the community, laughing, listening, connecting. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue across the city, Nathan and Emily walked together in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was filled with unspoken thoughts. Both of them had been changed by the experiences they were living through together, but Emily wasn't sure just how deep the change ran. Nathan stopped as they reached the small garden behind the mansion. The flowers were in full bloom, the evening air cool and fragrant with the scent of roses. He turned to Emily, his usual confident demeanor softened, replaced with something more vulnerable. "I want you to see something," Nathan said, his voice quieter than usual. There was a gentleness to his words now, something that didn't feel rehearsed. He handed her an envelope, and Emily took it hesitantly. Inside was a bank statement, a document showing that Nathan had returned the money from the original bet. The numbers stared back at her, but it wasn't just the amount that mattered. It was the action behind it, the gesture of returning what had originally been used to manipulate and control. He had donated a significant portion of it to various charities, to the very people they had been helping together. "I don't want you to think this was all just for the bet," Nathan said, his voice holding an unfamiliar sincerity. His eyes were steady on hers, no longer the distant gaze of the man who had seen her as just a challenge. There was something more in his eyes now, something she hadn't expected. "I'm not the man I was when I first met you." Emily's hands shook slightly as she read the document. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about what he had given. It was about the realization that Nathan, in some way, was trying to make amends. He had confronted his flaws, his coldness, and his past. And in doing so, he was showing her something new. He wasn't just apologizing. He was taking responsibility for what he had done, for the way he had treated her, and for how much he had changed since then. As she looked up at him, her chest tightened. She could see it now. This wasn't just a man trying to win her over with gestures. This was a man who had been forced to confront his own actions, his own past, and had decided to make a real change. He wasn't perfect, but for the first time, Emily saw something that resembled real effort, something that felt true. Her heart ached. She felt the weight of it all, the complexity of their relationship, the shared pain, and the slow unraveling of the walls they had both built around themselves. But there was still a deep wound inside her, one that was hard to ignore. The bet, the way he had once seen her, the coldness in his eyes when he had first met her, those memories still lingered, stubborn and raw. No matter how much Nathan had changed, the past couldn't just be erased. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could start to heal together. In the weeks that followed, Emily and Nathan began spending more time together, and slowly, something unexpected started to blossom between them. They weren't rushing things. There was no grand declaration of love, no sweeping promises. Instead, it was in the quiet dinners where they sat across from one another in softly lit rooms, in the gentle cadence of intimate conversations that lasted deep into the night, and in those simple, shared moments where silence said more than words ever could. Both of them were painfully aware that they were treading on fragile ground. The past still cast long shadows over every smile and every touch. But there was something undeniable, a connection that felt real and raw, something that went far beyond the initial arrangements and the old wounds that had once kept them apart. One cool evening, after a dinner where the soft clink of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation had given way to a quiet intimacy, Nathan asked Emily to walk with him to a secluded part of the mansion. They strolled along a garden path lined with blooming night flowers, their gentle fragrance mingling with the crisp air. The quiet of the night and the soft rustling of leaves provided the perfect backdrop for what was about to unfold. Reaching a small private courtyard bathed in the glow of moonlight, Nathan stopped and turned toward her. In his hand, he held a small, carefully wrapped box. His expression was different from the usual stoic, controlled look he wore. There was a softness there, a vulnerability that he rarely allowed to show. With a quiet smile, he handed the box to Emily. When she unwrapped it, she found a delicate silver butterfly pendant nestled inside. The pendant was intricately designed, its wings etched with fine lines that caught the light with every subtle movement. It wasn't an extravagant gift by any means, but in that moment, it felt priceless. Nathan's voice, soft and a little distant, broke the silence. "My mum gave this to me when I was a child," he said. "She used to say that butterflies symbolize transformation. I want you to have it." Emily's heart skipped a beat as she took the pendant from his hand. Her fingers brushed lightly against the cool silver, and for a moment, she felt as if the pendant was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a living reminder of everything they had been through. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type smartphone if you've made it this far. Only those who made it will understand. Now let's continue with the story. Each tiny detail on its wings seemed to hold a memory of pain and renewal, of the struggle to change and the promise that transformation was possible. It was as if that small butterfly embodied all the shifts in their lives, the ways in which they had both been forced to reinvent themselves. "Thank you," Emily said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. In that simple thank you lay a myriad of unspoken emotions, a mix of gratitude, hope, and a cautious acceptance of what the pendant represented. It was a promise, a symbol that even though the road ahead was uncertain, change was possible. Though she wasn't ready to fully let go of the past or fully embrace the future, the pendant was something she could no longer ignore. It was a token of their shared journey, a tangible reminder that transformation, however gradual and painful, was a beautiful and essential part of life. Standing there in the quiet of the moonlit courtyard, the silver butterfly glinted softly between them, its delicate wings catching the light and reflecting the subtle promise of new beginnings. Both Emily and Nathan felt in that fragile moment that perhaps they could find solace in each other, a chance to heal and grow, one quiet, honest moment at a time. The day of their wedding arrived, and it felt as if the entire world had been transformed. What was once just a lavish mansion now radiated warmth and promise, especially in the garden where the ceremony was to take place. The garden, with its winding paths and blooming flowers, no longer symbolized Nathan's cold wealth. It had become a living, breathing celebration of change, of healing, and of new beginnings. Guests gathered from near and far, their faces lighting up with genuine smiles. They weren't there because of some extravagant invitation or the allure of high society. They were close friends, colleagues from their community projects, and partners who had shared in the struggles and triumphs of their journey. The air was thick with joy and love, a stark contrast to the emptiness that once defined Nathan's world. Emily looked radiant in her simple, ethereal lace dress. It wasn't adorned with glitter or ostentation, yet her beauty shone through in the delicate fabric and the way it flowed with her every movement. There was an understated grace about her, a quiet strength that had grown from years of hardship and survival. Every detail, from the soft tendrils of her hair cascading over her shoulders to the gentle glow in her eyes, spoke of a woman who had not only endured, but blossomed in the face of adversity. Nathan stood by her side in a sharply tailored suit, his usual confident expression softened by emotion. For the first time in his life, his eyes were fixed solely on her. The grand gestures of wealth and status no longer held meaning. This was not about a bet, nor was it about proving his superiority. It was about the love that had grown quietly between them, a love forged in the fires of shared pain, redemption, and hope. As they stepped forward to exchange their vows, a palpable shift occurred in the very air around them. It buzzed with the energy of their journey, the countless challenges they had overcome, the moments of vulnerability, and the small victories that had stitched their hearts together. Every whispered word and every gentle touch during the ceremony resonated with the depth of their experience. I promise to always see you, not as a bet or a project, but as my equal, Nathan declared, his voice thick with emotion and sincerity. His words echoed across the garden, reaching the hearts of everyone present. In that moment, it wasn't about what had been lost or the mistakes of the past. It was about the future they were determined to build, together. Emily's smile was tender, and although her heart overflowed with warmth, her eyes still held a trace of caution. She had learned to trust him, but she knew that some wounds could only heal slowly. Yet, as she looked into Nathan's eyes, she saw a promise of understanding and unconditional care. And then, as the ceremony drew to a close, something shifted again. With the gathering still buzzing with the echoes of their vows, Emily pulled Nathan close, her voice a soft whisper that carried the weight of a life-changing secret. "I have something to tell you," she murmured, her eyes searching his for reassurance. Nathan's face lit up with surprise and anticipation. "What is it?" he asked, his tone gentle and filled with hope. Taking a deep breath, Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "We're going to have a baby." The words, spoken with a mix of trembling emotion and quiet certainty, hung in the air as if marking the beginning of a new chapter. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Nathan's face transformed instantly. His eyes widened with wonder, and a radiant smile broke across his features. In that instant, he pulled her into a tight embrace, as if he could hold her close and never let go, as if the promise of their future was too precious to ever be lost. "Are you sure?" he asked softly, his voice laced with joy and a newfound tenderness that belied the man he had once been. Emily nodded, her own smile fragile yet hopeful. "Yes," she replied, her words carrying the promise of hope and renewal. That joyful announcement was more than just news. It was the beginning of an entirely new chapter. It was a chapter filled with the promise of love, of growth, and the possibility of a future neither of them had ever dared to imagine. Together, they had transformed not only their own lives, but had also reached out to change the lives of others around them. Now, as they stood at the threshold of this new beginning, they would build a family, a legacy defined not by wealth or bets, but by love, hope, and the unwavering belief in second chances. And in that moment, as they held each other close amidst the soft murmur of heartfelt congratulations, both Emily and Nathan knew that their journey, with all its pain and beauty, had only just begun. Through a journey filled with pain, transformation, and unexpected love, Nathan and Emily learned that life isn't about money, power, or status. It's about the connections we make, the changes we're willing to undergo, and the hearts we open. The bet that began as a simple game had turned into something more meaningful, a love story neither of them could have predicted. What did you think of the transformation faced by Nathan and Emily? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next.